The brain contains 100 billion neurons stretched out across 100,000 miles of dense blood vessels. Neuroscience has only begun to figure out how it all works. While some scientists actively seek to create consciousness, others are stumbling into it, almost by accident encountering the soul. In the near future, one or the other might have to answer to the question, is there something that survives the body?
Well, consciousness is mysterious, and I believe when we create non-biological systems that have that same kind of behavior and the same complexity and richness of emotional intelligence, which is also a form of intelligence, they will be conscious as well.
If you ask somebody, do you believe you have an immortal soul, or do you believe you have a soul? I think that people would be exposing what are their most heartfelt hopes, their worst fears. So I think it's much easier for us to focus on what we can apprehend. Our intelligence, how smart are we? IQs, is that a measure of the soul? It certainly is a measure of the reasoning faculty, the intellect. So it doesn't have anything to do with the imagination. So it's a very limited view of what the soul is, and also a very temporal view.
Meanwhile, others believe that the more we seek scientific answers, the more likely we are to accept the fact that the soul exists.
I believe science and religion are coming together. And I think it's just simply going to take more time. And maybe in another 100 years, most people on the planet will know that the soul is real.
Dr. Peter Fenwick has studied the phenomena of near-death experience for years. Initially a skeptic, he is now a believer.
As far as near-death experiences are concerned, I didn't believe them. They happened in America, they happened in California, they certainly wouldn't happen in London. What we found out was that near-death experiences are very common. So I think we have to see consciousness no longer as just a point source generated by the brain, ends at death. It may do, but I think the evidence now is beginning to be against this. It looks as if it may split from the brain at the time of death.
Fenwick is doing a study of 1,500 heart attack patients who have had near-death experiences. He's placed objects in the ER room that the patient cannot see, unless the patient's consciousness somehow leaves his or her body. According to his study, the mind and the brain are not the same thing. They are separate. Although near-death experiences have been reported for decades, it's only recently that science has been willing to consider them as evidence of the soul. 13 million Americans have reported a near-death experience. The statistics are as high in other countries, and the stories have striking similarities.
It was 1972 when my car was sideswiped by a tank, or a car that was as big as a tank. I had a small fiberglass sports car and I was virtually run over in my own car.
Horribly injured, comatose, and near death, Howard Tibble lay in the critical care ward of a hospital.
Evidently, for the next 3 days, in intense pain, unable to talk to anybody or correspond in any way. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't know what was going on. Suddenly, it was nighttime. I knew it was night because the lights were on in the ward. And I felt no fear or pain or worry.
I heard so many stories of people who came to me and said that when they tried to tell somebody about their experience, let's take, for example, a near-death experience, that perhaps they spoke to their doctor and their doctor pathologized it and said that it was a hallucination, or maybe they'd had a brief psychotic break, or maybe that was some unconscious, unresolved neurotic issue. Always a negative label, which people who'd had such a positive experience, the label didn't fit. They were not getting validation.
This feeling of safety and peace has been reported in almost all near-death experiences. The next step is also almost universal, an out-of-body experience. Fully conscious, the dead person floats around the room, seeing objects that could not be seen face up on the bed.
I took myself on a little tour of the ward, just floating around, and this was a hospital with a high ceiling. And they had strip lights. And I floated up to the side of this strip lamp, and it had the word Osram, and I was 1 foot from it. I could have touched it, but I had no hands to touch it. And I didn't find it odd or anything. I thought, well, there you go. Osram make lamps, you know, it's fine with me.
The next step for most people is the soul's return to the body, bringing a memory of the experience that is not like a dream. It seems real.
We use the word soul as if it were a sort of thing that flies away to heaven, and it could be consciousness, it could be a mind, it could be a number of things. I actually believe it's the way out from here to start the journey to wherever we go. But I don't think we have to be religious to make that journey. I've not been that good in my life, you know. Rock and roll.
Clinical studies on near-death experiences indicate that something untangles itself from a dying body. But research has a long way to go before proving that a spirit-like something truly exists.
Whether or not we'll be able to validate the idea that there is a soul is always going to be an open question, because of course we never know. But what we do is we take information from some of the wider experiences which we can have. And if you take all those together, then you would argue that in some way, the old idea of there being different levels within the body, and some of these are able to continue after death, is a very good hypothesis, yeah.
81% of Americans believe in the soul. And yet out-of-body experiences are marginalized with UFO sightings and seeing ghosts. Fenwick's research aims to change that. He even believes science will soon be able to prove the existence of telepathy, linked souls speaking across space and time.
Do I think the consciousness can exist outside the brain? Well, there's lots of evidence to show that. They're all the telepathy experiments. In my field, there is what happens as you approach death. And there is something called deathbed coincidences. The dying person seems to make a visit to other people, but it's other people with whom they're closely emotionally attached. It's usually a strong emotional feeling that something has happened to somebody. And the evidence for this is getting very good. And I suspect in the course of the next few years will become much more into the mainstream.